bats have naturally evolved unique immune systems to allow them to tolerate viruses.
We very likely co-inhabited with bats for millennia.
Bats are the only group of mammal species that echolocate.
Bats are associated with pollinating some plants that have real commercial value. For example, the agave plant. Without bats, we wouldn't have tequila.
Bats, friend or foe? Tuesday at 8 and 19 GMT.
When war broke out in 1939, Britain's Spitfire was the master of the skies.
I'm looking around now. I can hear machine gun fire, but I can't see our Spitfires. Oh, here's one coming down now. Somebody's hit a German, and he's coming down. There's a long streak, and he's going slap into the sea, and there he goes. Smash!
But German engineers were quick to catch up. I'm Tuppence Middleton, and after the news in Spitfire, the People's Plane, I'll tell you how brilliant designers made the Spitfire fly faster and higher.
BBC News. The former president of South Africa, Jacob Zuma, has, for now, avoided going to jail after the Constitutional Court agreed to hear his appeal against a 15-month jail sentence. Mr Zuma was due to hand himself in by Sunday or face arrest after the court ordered he be jailed for failing to appear before an inquiry into corruption. A judge in the Vatican has indicted a Cardinal, Angelo Becciu, over financial crimes, making him the highest-ranked Roman Catholic priest to face such allegations. The Cardinal was ordered to stand trial along with 9 others on charges including embezzlement, money laundering, fraud and extortion. Officials in the U.S. state of Florida say they are rushing to demolish the remaining part of a tower block that collapsed 9 days ago, killing at least 24 people and leaving another 124 missing. They say the building is structurally unsound and will not be able to withstand Tropical Storm Elsa, which is due to hit Florida on Sunday. A former MP in Australia has said she was subjected to inappropriate touching and sexist comments while in office. In an excerpt from a book out next week, Julia Banks said one fellow MP had put his hand on her bare knee. In another incident, a cabinet minister had slid his hand up her thigh. Poland's former Prime Minister Donald Tusk has taken back his old job as head of the Civic Platform Party. He told party members in Warsaw he would fight what he called the evil that rules Poland. At the Euro 2020 football tournament a short time ago, Denmark were beating the Czech Republic 2-1, with a place in the semi-finals at stake. The winner will face either England or Ukraine, who play in the later game. BBC News.
The Spitfire's an astonishing aircraft. All through the Battle of Britain, it went head-to-head with the very best that the German Air Force flew over British shores.
I'm looking around now. I can hear machine gun fire, but I can't see our Spitfires. Oh, here's one coming down now. Somebody's hit a German, and he's coming down. There's a long streak. He's going down completely out of control, a long streak of smoke, and he's going slap into the sea, and there he goes. Smash!
But Germany's brilliant military engineers were ready to respond. I'm Tuppence Middleton, and this is Spitfire, the People's Plane.
The Focke-Wulf 190 came as a horrendous shock to the British Air Ministry because of the fact that for the very first time, confidence was starting to be lost in the Spitfire because it simply just couldn't compete.
The birds fly a lot better than we do. See how they wheel and bank and fly? Perfect. And all in one. Wings, body, tail, all in one.
If Britain and the Allies are to win the Second World War, the Spitfire has to fly faster and higher than ever before. September 1940. Smoke rises from the bombed shell of the Spitfire factory in Southampton on England's south coast. An ingenious plan is put into action, moving production away from the vulnerable city centre, a magnet for German bombers, to small towns and villages. Within weeks, brand new Spitfires take to the skies. But more of the same isn't good enough. Victoria Taylor is an historian at the University of Hull. She's an expert on the Luftwaffe.
It really was trying to be able to construct a fighter that could perform at all altitudes, that could match the Spitfire's agility and its speed, and ultimately packing more of a punch than the Me-109s had against the Spitfires in the Battle of Britain. And so the Focke-Wulf 190 was seen as this incredible improvement because of the fact that once it was eventually brought in, it was around 25 to 30 miles per hour faster than the Spitfire Mark V, and also having a better cockpit for visibility, and that it had an increased boost in which it could get that sort of additional power when it needed it.
The Spitfire has to be improved. Fast. The design department at Supermarine is well aware that the Germans are improving their existing fighters and designing new planes, but they're in desperate straits. Their offices suffered direct hits in the September bombings of the Southampton factory. They were moved out to the local university, but within weeks, the Luftwaffe had launched a bombing blitz on the city. Hundreds of civilians died, and an incendiary bomb narrowly missed the new drawing office. If they're going to improve the Spitfire, the design team has to get out of Southampton. As their city burns, hundreds of engineers, draftsmen and women, craftsmen and designers move 10 miles north to a very different world.
So the actual core of the house is still is from the 18th century. So it's a Georgian house, quite traditional style, Queen Anne style.
This is Hursley House, a classic English stately home, an 18th century mansion set in beautiful rolling parkland. It's the home of Lady Mary Cooper.
We're standing in the conservatory, very bright, very airy. Next to us through the doorway was the ballroom and then the withdrawing room and the drawing room.
Dave Key is the historian at Hursley Park.
All of those rooms, that entire east wing and this conservatory, were taken over by the design team, the drawing office. So where we're standing, it looks quite pleasant now, but it would have been crammed full of drawing boards.
Lady Cooper was a patriotic sort. She welcomed the team from Supermarine with an enormous floral display, a model Spitfire made out of chrysanthemums. If her home has to be requisitioned for the war effort, then so be it, but this muddy-booted invasion is sometimes just too much.
One of the things about an Edwardian house, or any actually stately home, is you have parts of the house that are for the family and guests, and parts of the house which are servants. So just here, we have a grand staircase designed for Lady Cooper and her family and guests. To the side of us, we have a doorway which leads to another staircase, which is for the staff. With Supermarine, they were using all the staircase, and they were chatting on the stairs. And this is particularly Lady Cooper found difficult to cope with, the fact that you had these basically working class people loitering on her staircase. A big culture shock for her.
For chief designer Joe Smith, Hursley Park is the perfect spot. Plenty of space for his design team, extensive grounds and outbuildings to build prototype aircraft, and my goodness, there's that delicious view.
Lots of large mirrors and very, very bright light. And if you look out of the window here looking south, it's pretty much an uninterrupted view right the way through to the Isle of Wight.
There's just one nagging irritation for Smith. Lady Cooper and her servants can't seem to grasp that Hursley is no longer hers. The butler would stroll through top-secret meetings on his way to the pantry, and her son proved to be a bit of a menace after a few bottles of beer.
Above, the staircase just to our side goes to the roof. And that's where the fire watch was. Lady Cooper's younger son, Alistair, was living here as well. He was an enthusiastic social drinker. And when the fire watch team were on the roof, he had a tendency to go up there with a load of beers and join them, which got a lot of very happy fire watch team, because it's pretty boring being on top of a roof in the middle of nowhere. All you can do is watch your own city get burned in the background. But not very good if you really are in charge of the safety of the site.
Something has to be done. Lady Cooper and Alistair must be removed. The perfect opportunity soon presents itself.
The butler hired a casual labourer to come in and be an assistant cook. They decided that a far better job would be to take the family silver and run with it. To do so, he set a fire as a distraction. All he actually managed to do was to knock himself out with the smoke, and so it was fairly about as incompetent a robbery as there's ever been. But it did give Supermarine the excuse that they've been looking for to say this is just not a tenable thing, and Lady Cooper was forced out.
At last, the Spitfire designers have the place to themselves, and the team can be expanded and refreshed.
I knew that I had skills that nobody else had, and therefore I was in a different category to the other girls.
Through the gates of Hursley Park cycles a very determined 18-year-old art student from Portsmouth by the name of Stella Broughton.
On my first day at Supermarine, I left home about 6 a.m. The cycle was some 30-odd miles. After having packed my bike with all I needed for the next week, I started to climb up Portsdown Hill, a climb of 6 in 1. Past Fort Widley, turned down Pigeon House Lane. For 3 miles, there was no need to pedal.
I was literally commandeered from working for the Navy to go and work on the Spitfire because my skills were required and no one else had those particular skills.
There are plenty of young women working at Hursley Park, including the skilled tracers who turned the designers' drawings into finished design sheets. But Stella joins a vital section dominated by men.
The drawing office comprised some 200 draftsmen, and my appointment had caused some embarrassment at the fact I would be the first female of under 21 years to sit at a board. The tracers were of different ages, and some were rather dismissive of what they called pretty pictures.
We had to clock in and out every day. Then I'd go to my desk, and there I would join my colleagues, 3 draftsmen, who prepared the initial drawings for the assembly of parts of the aircraft. Those drawings were then given to me, and I had to do the master linen copy of these drawings for printing. These were then sent out and were put into crates which contained parts of the assembly of the aircraft.
I was told that the drawings I had been given to do were to be sent to North Africa. A motorcyclist was waiting at the gates to get them to London, where they would then be put into crates and sent to General Montgomery. My drawings will be inside these crates to show how to assemble the Spitfire parts.
Stella is determined to hold her own. Nothing will stop her producing the very finest work on the new Spitfire designs, even if that means appealing to the very top, the Minister of Aircraft Production himself.
At college, I was top in lettering, and it was the lettering skills which were very important to Supermarine, because all the written stuff on the masters had to be read by people who didn't really understand English. So it had to be very, very clear. Then I wanted a particular ruler, we called them scales in those days, with a beveled edge so that I could get accurate lines. I went to the shop in Portsmouth, I got the pens, but they couldn't supply me with a ruler. They just weren't available. So I went back to the firm, told my boss, and he told his boss, and he told the head of the firm. And the head of the firm obviously had words with Lord Beaverbrook, who was the person in the government at that time responsible for aircraft production. And within a week I had a message from Lord Beaverbrook: go back to the shop in Portsmouth. I have arranged for one bevel-edged scale to be sent there, and that is to be sold to you and nobody else.
That's the spirit. Stella is a perfectionist, just like the father of the Spitfire himself. R.J. Mitchell was, and still is, regarded by many as one of the very greatest of aircraft designers. His influence guides the design team as they work frantically to produce a faster and feistier Spitfire.
The one outstanding and all-important requirement is speed. Every feature has to be sacrificed to this demand. The result of this is that every part of the aircraft just and only just fulfills its requirements.
R.J. Mitchell combined mechanical expertise with artistic flair and temperament. He was a pioneer of aircraft speed, taking over as chief designer at Supermarine in 1919 when he was just 24. In an interwar age obsessed by speed, glamour and elegance, he designed the world's fastest aircraft.
You can put your hand on this piece of Supermarine technology here and know that R.J. Mitchell himself saw this aircraft, touched this aircraft, worked on this aircraft and saw it win the Schneider Trophy, which I think is fantastic.
Andy Jones helps run the Solent Sky Museum in Southampton, home to a Spitfire F-24, and the plane that inspired it, a beautiful polished metal seaplane, a plane designed to win the Schneider Trophy, the competition for the fastest plane in the world.
By winning the third successive victory in 1931, the S6B won the Schneider Trophy outright for Great Britain. This machine later established a world speed record of over 407 miles per hour.
It's all built for speed, and you can see that in the design. Everything about it is streamlined. Aerodynamics. When Mitchell designed this aircraft, he didn't sit down to design an aesthetically pleasing aircraft. They wanted something that was fast, and they had this understanding now of aerodynamics. So what they ended up doing was these wonderful lines, these wonderful curves, purely about mathematics and aerodynamics. And what they ended up doing was designing something which looks stunning. She's in this wonderful blue colour and also a lot of bare polished metal. But importantly about this, and this is the link between the Schneider Trophy and the Spitfire, is that what Mitchell and his team learnt about high-speed flight from the Schneider Trophy, they came out and they had the most developed design team, they had most knowledge of high-speed flight after the Schneider Trophy, and they took all that design work, they took all that knowledge that they'd learnt from the Schneider Trophy, and they then put it into the Spitfire.
Mitchell saw the Spitfire fly, but never saw it fight. He died of cancer in 1937.
There's a quote that was made by Geoffrey Quill, the test pilot. R.J. Mitchell's greatest achievement, apart from the plane itself, was in putting together the team that designed, modified and maintained the Spitfire at its height.
Mitchell's successors at Supermarine operate in a very different world. Glamour and elegance are an irrelevance. The Spitfire has to become a better killing machine than anything the Germans can develop.
That sort of consternation that was created really did drive all of these developments to try and get the Spitfire to be the top dog again. You know, crisis breeds necessity and necessity breeds efficiency. So really it was a case of trying to boost the Spitfire's flattering assets whilst reducing the errors that it had made in terms of trying to come up against the Bf-109 and then of course the Focke-Wulf 190. As the Mark V Spitfire had been so quickly outclassed by the Focke-Wulf 190, the British knew that they really had to start making the necessary adaptations and developments in order to keep up with this frightening new fighter. So they started looking at increases in armament and in armour. They looked at its sort of centre of gravity by putting its radiators underneath each wing so it was a little bit more balanced out. It had improvements in visibility and in its horsepower of its engines.
At the outbreak of the war, the Spitfire Mark I had a top speed of 584 kilometres per hour. By the end of the war, the Spitfire was able to fly at 720 kilometres per hour and reach a flying altitude 3 kilometres higher.
The old Spitfire was pretty fast. This one's a lot faster, and it's certainly the answer to that Focke-Wulf 190 we've been hearing so much about.
The team at Hursley Park made this extraordinary speed of development possible. New, better designs could travel from the drawing board through mock-ups to full-size prototype aircraft, all on the one site that the Germans were never able to find and destroy.
So we're inside the stable yard here, just come through the stevedore archway. This was taken over along with parts of the house in 1940, and they actually erected a hangar over the top of the stable yard. So when you look at an aerial photograph, it's not immediately obvious that it's anything there. And it was here that test and research had most of their work. So a lot of the stress testing of alloys and so forth to make sure that they actually were capable of being used in the new planes or could cope with the new increased power of the engines. And this was where prototype work was done. So the archway we just come through, when they moved out of here and moved over to the experimental hangar where we're walking, they were carrying a Spitfire. They literally had to bring it out without the wings on, obviously. But that's how you made planes.
Many versions of the Spitfire were born at Hursley House. Interceptors, ground attack aircraft, reconnaissance planes, the Seafire that could take off from aircraft carriers, and the Mark IX that could match and beat the best the Germans had. As D-Day came and the Allied forces pushed through France, the Spitfire would be the master of the skies, destroying German fighters and supporting the bombers, ripping the heart out of the Nazi war effort. The Spitfire would be the only fighter aircraft built at the start of the war that was still being produced and sent into frontline action in 1945. It outlived all of its competitors.
I was very pleased that I was able to use my talents in such a way. It gives me a little bit of pleasure to know that I was one of the people who helped during the war to produce the plane which really saved this country.
In the next episode of Spitfire, the People's Plane, we take to the air and discover how it really felt to fly a Spitfire against a deadly foe.
Today's News.
BBC News with Sue Montgomery. The former president of South Africa, Jacob Zuma, has for now avoided going to jail after the Constitutional Court agreed to hear his appeal against a 15-month jail sentence for contempt of court. Mr Zuma was due to surrender by Sunday or face arrest. Will Ross reports.
Just a day before Jacob Zuma was due to hand himself over to the police and head for prison, South Africa's Constitutional Court has agreed to review its sentence, so at least for now the former president can sleep in his own bed. A decision on whether the sentence is upheld will be made in just over a week. Mr Zuma argues that in jail his life would be at risk due to the coronavirus pandemic, his age and health. Hundreds of supporters have gathered outside his home in Nkandla, KwaZulu-Natal province, vowing to ensure the former president never goes to prison.
Officials in the US state of Florida say they are rushing to demolish the remaining part of a tower block that collapsed 9 days ago. 24 people are confirmed dead and 124 remain unaccounted for. David Willis reports from Washington.
Officials fear a tropical storm that's forecast to hit the Miami Beach area late on Sunday night could bring what remains of the 12-story building crashing to the ground. So they've brought forward the potentially precarious demolition effort, which will involve boring into the structure of the building in order to install explosives, to Sunday morning. Once complete, that effort will give the search and rescue teams access to parts of the garage area that has been the focus of the search.
There are reports that an Israeli cargo ship has been attacked in the Indian Ocean. Israeli media said the crew was unhurt and the vessel wasn't badly damaged. It's not known who was behind the attack, but analysts say suspicion will fall on Iran. In recent months, Israel and Iran have been targeting one another's vessels at sea. The former European Council President Donald Tusk has returned to Polish politics after a 7-year absence to lead the country's main opposition party, Civic Platform. He hopes to return it to government in 2023. From Warsaw, Adam Easton sent this report.
Addressing his party, Mr Tusk said, "Yes, I'm back, 100%. He then made a blistering attack on the government, which many, both inside and outside Poland, say is undermining democracy and demonising LGBT people. Today, evil rules in Poland, Mr Tusk said. The 64-year-old plans to win elections in 2 years' time and return Poland to a liberal democratic and pro-EU path. Opinion polls suggest it will not be easy for him to garner enough support to defeat a government that remains popular."
World News from the BBC. A former MP in Australia has said she was subjected to inappropriate touching and sexist comments while in office. A review is currently taking place into workplace culture in the Australian Parliament. Michael Bristow reports.
In an excerpt from a book out next week, the former politician Julia Banks said one fellow MP had put his hand on her bare knee. In another incident, she said a cabinet minister had slid his hand up her thigh. She also accused the Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison of bullying and said he'd suggested she was emotionally weak. The Prime Minister rejected Ms Banks' allegations, but her comments will sharpen the anger felt by many in Australia over the treatment of women in politics.
Tens of thousands of people in cities across Brazil have been protesting against the government of President Jair Bolsonaro, calling for his resignation over his handling of the coronavirus pandemic. The demonstrations were triggered by recent allegations of corruption. 2 soldiers in Equatorial Guinea have been given prison sentences of 35 and 50 years at a trial that followed March's explosions at an army camp. Over 100 people were killed and 600 injured. At the Euro 2020 football tournament, Denmark have just beaten the Czech Republic 2-1 to reach the semi-finals. The Danes hit their stride after a disastrous opening game in which their star player Christian Eriksen suffered a cardiac arrest. They will now face either England or Ukraine, who play shortly. The English start as favourites, but the Ukrainian side believe they can spring a surprise. This Ukrainian fan said it was about more than football.
It's a historical achievement for our national team already, and more than that, football is a sport that unites the whole country, and for our country it's rough times these days, and we do believe in our national team. It's young, it's ambitious, we believe in it.
BBC News.
Hello, this is the History Hour with me, Max Pearson, and the Witness History team. This week, was the truth ever out there? A UFO mass sighting in the 1990s. More down to earth, and from the same decade, the world's first offshore wind farm, and a provocative playwright from 1970s Syria. But we're going to begin this week in China, which is currently celebrating the centenary of the founding of the Chinese Communist Party. Egged on by emissaries from newly Soviet Russia, the party officially came into being in July 1921. Mao Zedong was there, and later in 1945 he became party leader. Under his stewardship, the Communist Party became the most powerful organisation in China, and in 1949, over 20 years after its formation, it took control of the country. Yashan Zhao from the BBC's Chinese service has spoken to a man called Zhu Zhender, who was a young recruit in the People's Liberation Army in 1949 and was there at the celebrations in Tiananmen Square when Mao Zedong declared the foundation of the People's Republic of China. This is truly remarkable living history. And Yashan is in Hong Kong at the moment, but she's been telling me how she managed to track down this first-hand witness.
So Zhu Zhender, he was one of the few people who were still alive who witnessed the huge ceremony in Tiananmen Square in 1949. So I searched online and his name came up. So his story was told by a Beijing photographer, and I contacted the photographer and he gave me the contact of local Communist Party's propaganda office. So that was how I started my journey to deal with the Communist Party's propaganda office.
And in order to get access to this person via the Communist Party's propaganda department, you had to jump through some very serious hoops and some communication problems.
Oh yes, the Communist Party was very strict with their own set of requirements or format. So they asked for some paperwork. In the end, I spent 2 days finishing all the paperwork, and that wasn't the end of the story. I then needed to find the fax machine in the BBC's building, so I ran upstairs and downstairs. That was a very good exercise in the building though.
It is extraordinary that there must be so few of these people who were around at the time of the communist takeover in China who can talk about these things, and they are revered still by the Communist Party.
Yes, and Zhu Zhender, he was 92 when he talked to me in 2019. So he was one of the about 200,000 young soldiers of the Liberation Army. He was very proud that he took part in the huge ceremony.
Yes, and that's fascinating. Thank you so much for that. And let's hear from the man himself, Zhu Zhender.
毛主席就在天安门呢，是吧？毛主席。
I saw Chairman Mao and the other leaders of the country in Tiananmen Square. I was so excited and overwhelmed. I felt so optimistic.
Zhu Zhender was just 19 years old and a new recruit in the People's Liberation Army when he took part in the celebrations.
我们夜里的4点钟就出发。
We started at around 4 in the morning and walked 20 miles from our compound south of Beijing to Tiananmen Square. There were so many people in Tiananmen Square, you could hardly move. The infantry marched after the ordinary people's groups, then the Air Force and the Navy and tank forces. Every single one of us wanted to do our best and be proud of ourselves.
正步走，齐步走。
We had a month's practice for the parade. We learned how to goose step in unison.
睡不好觉啊，真老，哎呦喂！
I was so excited and proud to join the parade. I kept thinking about my steps. If my commander ordered us to look right, would I be able to do it?
But he did do it, and even caught a glimpse of Chairman Mao.
I declare the foundation of the People's Central Government of the People's Republic of China.
The Japanese had occupied much of China in the 1930s, but they'd been driven out at the end of World War II, by a joint force of Mao's People's Liberation Army and the nationalist Kuomintang. But in 1945, the civil war started. The communist forces battled against the Kuomintang for 4 more years. Zhu Zhende was a poor teenager living in Beijing under the control of the Kuomintang.
Life was so hard at that time. An undercover Communist Party member approached me and explained that the Communist Army was different from the Kuomintang. It worked for the people and it helped those of us who were poor. Then I noticed that the Communist Party soldiers were helping Beijing citizens with their house cleaning and fetching buckets of water for them. I was impressed that they wanted to help and to serve the public. It made me feel like they were family.
By the summer of 1949, the Communists had defeated the Kuomintang and taken control of most of mainland China. Chairman Mao said the key to their success was the fact they were supported by most of the population in the countryside, the so-called Peasants' Army.
Their soldiers were trained to spread a political message, that the peasants didn't have to starve and be exploited, that China could be run in a reasonable way. The peasants had never known soldiers to behave like this before. They had to help the people, pay for everything they needed, leave everything clean, respect women, never damage crops.
Zhu Zhende was one of the tens of millions of Chinese who had suffered poverty and famine under Kuomintang rule. The Communist Party and its army gave hope to people from the lowest social classes.
That's when I decided to become a communist soldier in Beijing. There was a ceremony. I wore a huge red paper flower on my chest. We were welcomed with cheers and smiles.
Zhu Zhende's life had not been easy under Kuomintang rule. Kuomintang soldiers had a reputation for stealing from ordinary citizens and attacking women. For many poor Chinese, the idea of revolution was very appealing.
Ever since childhood, my life was tough. When I was 6, my father died, and my mother and I had to go on the streets and beg for a living. It was hard trying to survive. Everyone was poor. My mother used to clean people's houses and look after other people's children, but it wasn't enough. After trying lots of different ways to keep food on the table, my mother had to marry again to survive. I went to a local factory to learn how to make and fix bikes, but I still couldn't earn enough to buy basics like bread and butter. So I learned how to ride rickshaws to earn more money.
But after he had joined the People's Liberation Army, Zhu Zhende didn't look back.
When I was in the army, I did really well and won lots of medals. After I left, I worked at Beijing Airport for 30 years. I was the only person there to win the award for Devoted Pioneer.
And yet, despite his devotion to communism, strangely, Zhu Zhende was never allowed to join the Chinese Communist Party.
I often tell my children and grandchildren that I was so proud to join the army. But even now, I deeply regret that I was not able to join the Communist Party. I think it was because I was illiterate. I never had the chance to go to school and get an education.
But when I spoke to him, Zhu Zhende still credited the Communist Party with transforming his life for the better.
Without the Communist Party, I wouldn't be who I am today. Each of my 3 children settled down with jobs and apartments in Beijing. And now I have a decent pension in my retirement. I won't forget what the Communist Party did for me.
Zhu Zhende was one of Communist China's true success stories. During his long life, he witnessed the massive expansion of China's economy and infrastructure, and improvements in most people's daily lives. And yet, even he had some reservations.
At that time, I thought our country would become a communist society where everyone could be fed and everyone would have a job. But there's a long way to go to reach the final goal of building a communist society.
That was Zhu Zhendare talking to Yashan Zhao and taking us right back to one of the most significant moments in 20th century history, the birth of modern communist China. If that has whetted your appetite, don't forget that there's a whole section on our website devoted to Chinese history. Just search for BBC Witness History Collections. Next, as the US government has just released a long-anticipated but somewhat underwhelming report into its analysis of reported UFO sightings, we thought we'd delve into one of the most striking examples of alleged alien activity. In 1994, local people in the quiet rural town of Rua in Zimbabwe reported seeing strange lights in the sky, and around 60 children said they'd seen a spaceship and aliens near their school playground. The children drew pictures of what they'd seen. Rebecca Kesby has been listening to the archive reports filed by a BBC TV crew who were among the first on the scene.
There's been a UFO alert across southern Africa. A large, brightly coloured object was seen travelling very fast above Zimbabwe, Zambia and South Africa. Several planes saw it. The experts are baffled.
Okay, this is a continuation of possible UFO story. Rua, Ariel School, 19th September 94, 12:12 local time.
In mid-September 1994, BBC Zimbabwe correspondent Tim Leach and his TV crew got sent on an unusual story.
Tell me, what are they saying in Mbari about this unidentified flying object?
They are saying that Jesus is passing through Africa.
They don't think it's a meteor?
No, they don't think so.
It's one of the most widely reported UFO sightings of the past 50 years, and yet it's relatively unknown outside Africa.
We thought it was a helicopter at first, and when we actually paid attention to it, we realised it was a cigar-type shape, a long shape. But I say it's a scary thing to say you saw a UFO.
Well, the authorities are taking the sightings very seriously. Leon van Renberg is the tower controller at Jan Smuts Airport in Johannesburg.
It was spotted by several aircraft around about the same time, and also later on we received reports from Zimbabwean and Zambian air traffic controllers that they also received reports from aircrew that could see this bright thing in the sky.
Several people across the region reported seeing strange lights in the sky and what seemed to be some kind of craft, but moving in a way that no human-made plane or helicopter can.
Okay, take two. Can you just tell us what happened the other night at Kariba?
We suddenly looked up and we saw this thing coming over the top of the hill. At first sight, maybe seeing a fuselage of an aircraft. As it sort of came abreast of us, it suddenly changed from this glow to, let's say, two big red-orange balls. Again, first thought was an Airbus 300 with the two engines. But then one thing we noticed about it was the lack of sound. In total, I would say about 14 people saw this, in our group anyway.
But what makes this story even more strange is not just the number of witnesses from different countries, or the pilot testimonies, or the air traffic controllers' concerns, but the number of eyewitness accounts of what can only be described as aliens.
I feel sure that the children feel that they did see something. I don't believe or disbelieve, to be perfectly honest, but I do feel that they definitely saw something. We had a number of children say they did.
What do you think that was?
I agree that it could be something that we are not common with, but to actually say that it was a UFO, I would be reluctant to make a decision like that. I personally did not see it.
Colin Mackey. He was the principal teacher at Ariel Elementary School in the quiet rural town of Rua in Zimbabwe. It was just another ordinary sunny day as the children charged out into the playground for their morning break, unaware of the reported drama in the skies above them. Girls and boys, aged between 8 and 11, and from a mixture of backgrounds and ethnicities. But around 60 of them say they saw exactly the same thing. A spaceship.
Well, it looked like it was like glinting in the trees, like a disc.
Are you sure it wasn't a Harrier jump jet or an aircraft?
No.
Something that the Zimbabwe Air Force
It was like
have got?
in a disc. It was just glinting in the trees.
We were in the classroom and I ran out and I saw it.
The children said they were drawn to something shiny in the long grasses at the edge of the playing field that led into the wild African bush.
I saw something silver on the ground amongst the trees. It looked like a saucer, but the shape wasn't really round.
Many of the children reported seeing figures, not much taller than they were themselves, standing on or around the craft.
I saw the little black men. They had longish hair. They kind of turned around and stared and then went back into a kind of like ship. There was like sort of one big one with quite a few little ones scattered around.
Yes, he was very, very shiny black kind of suit. It was tight-fitting. I just thought it was some kind of alien from a different planet.
There was a man and he walked towards us and he walked back again.
And what does he look like?
His face was like this and his eyes were down here.
Here, the children are holding up their hands to their size and shape of the being's eyes. Like rugby balls, they say, their fingers tracing big oval shapes, starting high on their foreheads and circling low onto their cheeks.
He was dressed in black and he had big eyes.
Show me with your hand how big the eyes
They
were.
were shaped like something like that.
Oval, kind of like that.
Mr. Mackey asked the children to draw pictures of what they'd seen. They vary in quality, but the details and proportions are strikingly similar. A dome-shaped disc on 3 sticks or legs nestling under the trees. It's worth remembering that at the time, Zimbabwe had no internet and barely any TV. These were country children living a simple life. But of course we can't know what images of UFOs they may have already been exposed to before.
Did it make any noise, this thing?
Not really, no.
And then what happened?
And then he walked towards us and he walked back again and they just went.
How? How did they go?
It just went all of a sudden.
What, like a helicopter?
No,
Went up?
just went. And then it didn't come back again.
And did you girls see that as well?
Yes.
Parents and teachers wanted to be sceptical, but the children were so convincing and so consistent. And besides, adults in the area had also seen strange events in the sky.
Sorry, what did you see?
I just saw a glow over my chicken run. I stared at it.
It was a helicopter or
No,
what?
it was just a big round ball. The bottom was flat, but it was round.
He just said these people came towards him on the road. He said it was like a spirit, and he tried to avoid it. He swerved. He ditched his truck.
Later, the head of the psychiatry department at Harvard Medical School, John E. Mack, also arrived to speak to the children. His interviews with them reveal another element, that some of the children say they received some sort of message from the beings about the environment and protecting the Earth.
What I thought was maybe the world's going to end. Maybe they're telling us the world's going to end. Maybe because we don't look after the planet and the area properly. I just felt all horrible inside. It was like in the world, all the trees will just go down and there will be no air and people will be dying.
Oh, goodness. Don't forget, that was back in 1994, and the report was from Rebecca Kesby. Now, UFO sightings have long been treated with scepticism and disbelief, but, as I mentioned, in the US, the military has recently been taking evidence of sightings more seriously. And last week, the Pentagon, the US Defense Department, issued a report stating that it doesn't have explanations for more than 100 sightings of unidentified flying objects. Gideon Lewis-Krauss is a writer at The New Yorker and has been reporting on this subject extensively, and it joins us now. So does the publication, Gideon, of this Pentagon report put any of the long history of alleged UFO sightings to bed?
I certainly don't think so. One thing to note, especially in the context of the Ariel school sighting, is that these really, the movement, if one could describe it that way, in the States over the past few years to pay more attention to these things has really focused on a fairly narrowly circumscribed group of sightings, that these are almost exclusively sightings by military pilots, sightings that have been picked up in and around military installations. This is really restricted to things that our trained military pilots have either seen or have registered on their sensors. And the report has been very inconclusive. The upshot of it was that further study is needed, which is more or less what any version of this kind of report has said for the last 70 years or so.
Does it attribute any possible explanations?
I mean, of course, there are the normal buckets of explanation that are offered that, this could be atmospheric conditions, and then it could also be a category they describe as airborne clutter, which includes everything from flying plastic bags to deflating balloons to birds. Then, of course, there's the possibility that it's some kind of classified technology of ours or classified technology of some adversary. And then, of course, there's the category everybody has seized on, which is the catch-all bin of other. And it's hard to imagine what other could possibly mean in this case besides, potentially otherworldly vehicles. I mean, which sounds completely astounding, but it's also not something that they've ruled out in this report.
So they do leave the door open, so to speak. Does the frequency of reporting sightings over the past decades, does that fluctuate with the international situation? I'm thinking because clearly in the 1950s and 60s, it was an era of paranoia in the US over the Cold War, and yet there do seem to be a lot of sightings during those years, alleged sightings, and the media at the time, film and television, was quite happy to feed into all that.
I think it's hard to say anything categorical about the data on the history of sightings because the environmental conditions have changed so much, and so much of that depends on cultural issues like the taboo, that it wasn't a particularly taboo thing to report a UFO sighting between roughly 1947 and 1969, so of course there were a lot then, and then once the US government essentially came out at the end of 1968 and said, really, we funded this independent external academic body to look at this stuff, and they didn't find anything worth pursuing, that of course once it became just a matter of ridicule, sightings were going to decrease, and then there's been an uptick of sightings in recent years, and whether that has to do with the dismantling of the taboo, it seems to certainly be related to that.
So the stigma the sense of stigma around these things will wane, and that probably lead to more reporting.
It certainly seems that way. I mean, another thing that the Pentagon report mentioned was that there's a strong collection bias or a sample bias where these things have been reported in and around military installations, in part because that's where people are looking for these things, and that's where we have particularly sensitive instruments that might be picking these up. So there's kind of an open question over, is that because it does reflect the presence of some kind of surveillance drone sent by an adversarial nation, or is that simply because those are places where people are looking? So one of the things that they said in the report was that they really need more data to baseline this, to get a sense for whether there actually is a relatively high incidence of reports surrounding military installations in restricted airspace, or whether that's just a function of sample bias.
Gideon Lewis-Krauss of The New Yorker, many thanks to you. With those thoughts hanging in the ether, don't go anywhere. The History Hour will be back in just a moment.
This is the BBC World Service, bringing together artists from around the world to discuss their lives in music.
Everything always sounds different live. Naturally, the more you play songs, the more they tend to change anyway.
I'm Mogwai guitarist and vocalist Stuart Braithwaite. I'll be joined by rock guitarist David Pajo, Slowdive's Rachel Goswell, and artist, composer and director Dublond.
Gigs that I do now are a lot more lively, so I do have those thoughts pass through where I'm like, oh, this one's going to be really fun.
We'll be talking about how lockdown has affected our creative process, whether we think about the live performance when we're writing, and how being a music fan impacts our own work.
I do understand wanting to be faithful to the record in some sense, like when we did the Slint reunions. A lot of people only know the recorded version of the song, and so we went over the top trying to make it sound like the album.
Music Live, today at 21 GMT.
Coming up in part 2 of the History Hour, from the early 1990s, a pioneer of offshore wind power. From the 1980s, the first Chinese students sent abroad to study. And from the 70s, in Syria, a playwright prepared to provoke.
In the end, he hoped that the play would cause people to rise up from the theatre, go and protest and gather to bring down the regime or denounce the tragedy that had just happened.
First, here's a news summary.
BBC News with Eileen McHugh. The former president of South Africa, Jacob Zuma, has for now avoided going to jail after the Constitutional Court agreed to hear his appeal against a 15-month jail sentence. Mr. Zuma was due to hand himself in by Sunday or face arrest after the court ordered he be jailed for failing to appear before an inquiry into corruption. Officials in the U.S. state of Florida say they are rushing to demolish the remaining part of a tower block that collapsed 9 days ago. 24 people are confirmed dead and another 124 are missing. The officials said the building could not withstand Tropical Storm Elsa, which is due to hit Florida on Sunday. An Israeli cargo ship has been attacked in the northern Indian Ocean. Israeli officials are reported to believe that Iran was responsible. The crew is said to have been unhurt and the ship wasn't seriously damaged. It was on its way from the Saudi port of Jeddah to the UAE. A former MP in Australia has said she was subjected to inappropriate touching and sexist comments while in office. In an excerpt from a book out next week, Julia Banks said one fellow MP had put his hand on her bare knee. Tens of thousands of people in cities across Brazil have been protesting against the government of President Jair Bolsonaro. They are calling for his resignation over his handling of the coronavirus pandemic following recent allegations of corruption. Poland's former Prime Minister Donald Tusk has taken back his old job as head of the Civic Platform Party. He told party members in Warsaw he would fight what he called the evil that rules Poland. And at the Euro 2020 football tournament, Denmark have just beaten the Czech Republic 2-1 to reach the semi-finals. The winner will face either England or Ukraine, who play shortly. And that's the latest from BBC News.
Welcome back to part 2 of the History Hour with Max Pearson and the Witness History team. Still to come, we've got a second story with China at its heart. This, though, focuses on the first students to venture out of communist China to study in the US in the 1980s, plus a radical Syrian playwright from the 1970s. But before that, Luis Hidalgo is here. And this week, Luis, you've been looking into the history of what might turn out to be a planet-saving technology.
Well, Max, I've been looking back at the construction of the world's first offshore wind farm. It was in 1991 off the coast of Denmark, a town called Vindeby in the Baltic Sea. And the man who oversaw the project was this Danish inventor and really one of the great pioneers of wind energy in Denmark, Henrik Stiesdal. And he told me how he actually built his first wind turbine when he was just aged 19. Extraordinary story. Henrik Stiesdal says it was on a cycling trip to Britain in 1976 that it first occurred to him that there must be better ways of generating energy than using fossil fuels.
During that trip, I happened to pass on my way north a power station. It was bright, crisp autumn morning, very sunny and nice, and I was cycling along with a tailwind, so life was sweet. But then I passed a power station with big cooling towers. And out of those towers came steam, as steam does. The steam didn't just evaporate, but became a long plume that gradually became cloud. And that meant that I was cycling for several hours in the shadow of this imprint of a big power station. And I think that was actually the first time I really thought, this is not good, this is not how it should be.
Humans have been harnessing the wind for millennia to power boats and the windmills that were once a common sight across northern Europe. It's thought that the first wind turbine to generate electricity was built in Scotland back in 1887, but it wasn't until half a century later, in the 1950s, that the precursor to the modern wind turbine was invented in Denmark.
There was a Danish head of technology at a large Danish utility who had lived through the 2 world wars and had experienced in both wars that we had a shortage of energy supply. And he persuaded his power company to fund a little group of experimental turbines. And that turbine ran from 57 to 67 and showed that you could do this and it could be made into kind of like an everyday occurrence.
There wasn't much enthusiasm or incentive to develop the wind turbine further, however, until the 1973 oil crisis.
The era of cheap fuel and cheap energy is over.
In recent months, we have taken many actions to increase supplies and to reduce consumption. But even with our best efforts, the period of temporary shortages was inevitable.
When the oil crisis came, people around the world started looking into alternative energy. There were a lot of new projects that came up, including the NASA projects.
NASA, the American Space Agency, was told by the US government in 1975 to start developing wind turbines for commercial use. Back home in Denmark, on the family farm where he'd grown up, the young Henrik decided with his father to build their own wind turbine.
We started building a small wind turbine, very small, just a little over 1 meter diameter that you could actually hold in your hand. You would hold the shaft in your hand and feel it when you ran it. And that was another eye-opener, that you felt all this energy in the wind. If you went out on a day with a significant amount of wind, it is as if it gets alive. It really sort of felt quite dramatic. And that was a very tangible, tactile feeling of the power in the wind.
The next challenge was to build a turbine big enough to generate electricity for the farm.
So I made a 3-meter turbine that I mounted on the farm wagon, so I could pull it out with the tractor into the field on a windy day. And even this little turbine could produce more power than what we were using at that time on the farm. Of course, it wouldn't be that windy all the time, and therefore I decided to build a 10-meter turbine installed on a 12-meter tall tower. And that's what I got started with in 1977.
To build the turbine, Henrik had enlisted the help of a local blacksmith. In return, he'd agreed to design the blacksmith his own bigger wind turbine.
Such a machine could produce enough power for 3 or 4 households. And based on that, my friend really wanted for us to join forces and build a factory and become manufacturers. But I was not interested in that. I didn't have any desire to become a businessman, and I had not yet been to university, and I wanted to study. Actually, I started studying medicine. So ultimately, we ended up getting in touch with a neighboring machine factory that we had heard had some interest in wind power. And that machine factory, the Danish company Vestas, and that's how they got started. They are the biggest company in wind power and have been that since the 80s. And that all started with them acquiring our technology.
Today, the Danish company Vestas is $1 billion business with bases across the world and supplies 40% of the world's offshore wind turbines.
It ended up being my passion, and it's still my passion. From about sort of 88, 89, 90, I became aware of the climate issue, this climate challenge. And it gradually dawned on me that this was not just about running a company or making a small country that had no internal resources, more independent of external energy, that it was a much, much bigger game than that. And then that became the main driving factor for my part. And it's about feeling that you do something that you're actually pretty good at. And we had that very, very much in this small Danish wind industry that became big, that, wow, we are actually able to compete with big American companies and so on. That was a very heady feeling.
In 1989, the Danish government decided it was time to look not just at onshore wind power, but offshore too. By then, the boom in wind energy production in the United States, and in particular California, had begun to collapse as the oil crisis of the 1970s gave way to a 1980s oil glut.
Offshore wind had been a strong part of the conversation about wind power already in the 70s and early 80s. Then we had the big boom in California. Everybody focused on onshore. And then after the California market collapsed, the Danish government had seen that at some point in time there could be a saturation of the onshore market. And therefore they announced that they would instruct the big utilities to build 2 demonstration wind farms offshore. And for us this was wow. And we wanted the first project because it would be an unbeatable reference forever to have built the first in the world, and it became the unbeatable reference.
The company Henrik then worked for was called Bonus Energy, and it put Henrik in charge of the project.
Bonus Energy, the oldest wind turbine manufacturer in Denmark.
And was it very different putting wind turbines in the sea rather than on land?
There are, of course, some challenges with the wind offshore, but the wind is also steadier and therefore not so rough on the equipment as it is onshore. We used the biggest turbine we had at the time, and it was actually the biggest that was on the market.
11 of these big 450 kilowatt turbines are placed in the world's first offshore
and you put them up in record time, didn't you? But you could only work, obviously, when the sea was calm.
We actually ended up installing the 11 turbines in 7 effective days. So it was very thrilling at the time and very exciting.
That first offshore wind farm near the town of Vindeby on the Baltic Sea continued to generate electricity for the next 26 years. Today, offshore wind energy accounts for 15% of Denmark's electricity, and Henrik believes could supply the electricity needs of the world 10 times over.
Overall, I feel that we have really set a path for how the world could solve a big element of the climate challenge. And I'm, of course, very happy about having played a small part in that.
That was Henrik Stiesdal speaking to Luis Hidalgo. Plenty more on the history of the environmental movement available on our website. Search for BBC Witness History. Next up, as promised, we have a second story from China. While celebrations are taking place to mark 100 years since the founding of the Communist Party in China, those festivities will also be echoed in many university cities around the world. That's because, according to the Chinese Ministry of Education, there are more than 600,000 Chinese students studying abroad. This is a relatively new phenomenon, but it was back in the 1980s that the first cohort of Chinese students went to the USA to study. Farhana Haider from the Witness History team has been talking to one of those intrepid students. Farhana is with me now. Who is she?
Hi, Max. So yes, Jia Jiaying is a Chinese-American writer. She was one of the first students to travel to the US to study from communist China after the normalization of relations between the two countries. And that, of course, followed the secret trip in 1971 by Henry Kissinger, who was the US Secretary of State at the time. So this was all groundbreaking stuff at the time. Communist China had been cut off from the rest of the world for over a decade. She's been telling me her story.
So this telegram was delivered to me. I remember I was in the Peking University student dorm, and it was only 3 sentences. Application received. We have scholarship. Please send transcript. This meant everything to me.
In 1980, Jiaying was a student at the newly reopened Peking University, now Beijing University. At the time, China was just emerging from its so-called Cultural Revolution, which had thrown the country into a decade of chaos. Jiaying was 7 when the Cultural Revolution was launched in 1966 by the communist leader Chairman Mao. Mao mobilized the country's young people to eliminate his rivals, and for much of the next decade, students were judged on their political fervor rather than their academic abilities. No child was too young to join in.
In some cases, beat up their teachers. In some cases, burning books, and the whole Chinese school system collapsed. So I ended up out of the kindergarten with no school to go. So I grew up in this environment that was very chaotic and confusing. And from elementary school through high school, we had actually very slapdash kind of curriculum. And all of us, we also have to, periodically being sent to factories and farms to do so-called re-education.
The Cultural Revolution ended when Mao died in 1976. One of the first signs that it was really over was when university entrance exams were reinstated.
And I was among the very first group to be able to pass the exam and was admitted into, in my case, Peking University. But it was still a very early stage of China's opening to the world. So there were very little information about foreign studies.
But foreign studies were happening on a small scale. By 1979, Chinese students were being sent to America to study. They were mostly mature students and were sponsored by the communist government. It was during her 3rd year at Peking University that Jiaying learned from fellow students that you could apply for foreign scholarships on your own.
So I basically went to the public libraries in Beijing and just looked up the university guides and copied down like more than a dozen addresses, including like famous ones like Harvard University, Stanford, down to some state universities which I didn't even know where they are.
Jia Ying was so ignorant about the process that she had in fact applied to all these colleges at the wrong time in the academic year, and the window for scholarship applications had already closed.
And so I got replies uniformly almost, starting with Harvard saying, well, scholarship time is over and you could try us next year. Luckily, I got a telegram from University of South Carolina and later found out they treated me as an exceptional case because in the history of their English department, there has never been applicants from the so-called Red China, mainland China. So they decided to take a chance on me. I was a Chinese language and literature major, so my English was really shoddy. So I had to get my English teacher to sign me off.
With her English teacher's help, Jia Ying sent off her application and was offered the scholarship from the University of South Carolina. Next came another hurdle. With her minimal English, she had to go to the US consulate in Beijing for an oral interview to prove that she was qualified for the scholarship.
And I drew a blank on the spot and spoke so haltingly and brokenly that I thought I failed. And I remember this young American visa officer looking at me with no expression. And I thought, that's it. But then the next thing he asked me, he said, you're getting a scholarship in the English department? I said, yes. And he said, I think they've made a terrible mistake. But then the next thing he said, but go ahead and good luck. And at that point, he kind of let out a smile, and I almost broke into tears of joy.
Even with a scholarship, going to America would be a financial struggle.
China was dirt poor, then none of us could afford to actually, pay tuition. My one-way ticket from Beijing to, South Carolina cost half of my parents' life saving.
The pressure was really on for you to succeed.
Yes, you're absolutely on your own. So if you don't make it, for example, in my case, I wouldn't even have a return ticket.
So with her one-way ticket, Jia Ying left China in 1981 to attend the University of South Carolina. And when she got there, America was not what she had imagined.
I arrived in this little college town with very few, skyscrapers. And I thought America should be like Manhattan everywhere, So I was very surprising.
So what was life like for you in South Carolina with your minimal English? How did you manage?
My poor English immediately, was revealed. So I ended up taking English classes for foreign students for a whole first year.
During that year, she moved in with students from South Carolina to improve her English and to immerse herself in American culture. As the first student from communist China, she was a novelty on campus.
So my professor would be showing me off wherever he had opportunity to say, look, this is Miss Jia from the mainland China, And everywhere I went, I would be the only Asian face. And I would be the object of curiosity. I would get all these very basic questions about China. It was a time where China was still largely kind of separated from the rest of the world, especially in the American South.
Jia Ying completed a master's degree in 1984, and then wanting to gain more experience of America, she went to New York and got another master's from Columbia University, after which she returned to China in 1987. But the student uprising in Tiananmen Square in 1989 meant that her return was short-lived.
This army was launching into an unarmed civilian population as if charging into battle. A line of soldiers was strung out facing a huge crowd. The air was filled with shouts of "Fascists! Stop killing!"
I was not on the blacklist, so I was able to leave about 15 days after the massacre. And I returned to New York. And so that was basically the closure of a whole chapter in China for me.
The US is still the #1 destination for students seeking to study abroad. But Jia Ying says that they have a different attitude to the students of her era.
These later Chinese students, they're more kind of nationalistic, and they have very mixed feelings about America. They have more kind of darker view of the US-China relations as a power relation. And a lot of them would not necessarily see US as a role model, but as a country where, you can keep learning the skills, but it's not a model for China to copy or even to be friendly with anymore.
That was Jia Jiaying speaking to Farhana Haider. Finally this week, a moment of cultural history from the Middle East. This is the story of an experimental play staged in Damascus in 1971, which undermined official Syrian propaganda at the time when it was first performed. Zach Brophy has been speaking to Faiza Sawish, the widow of the playwright Saadallah Wanous, who was turned into an opposition figure by daring to write openly about the Arab nation's defeat by Israel during the 1967 Six-Day War.
In the 1960s, theatre was a new thing for us. I was an actor in the National Theatre from the very beginning. It was the golden age of theatre in Syria.
It was on Syria's burgeoning theatre scene that actor Faiza Shawish met the up-and-coming playwright Saadallah Wanous. Faiza and Saadallah married and lived together until his death in 1997. In the mid-60s, they were among a young generation infused with hope.
We had such idealistic dreams, not just for Syria, but for the whole Arab world. We wanted a democratic, secular state and an open and free relationship between the individual and the government. We had such enthusiasm for these ideals.
Secular Arab nationalism was on the ascendant. Dreams of a restoration of Arab pride, power and prestige flourished. Tensions and the potential for conflict with Israel intensified. Then, on the 5th of June 1967, rhetoric became reality.
It began quietly enough, a puzzling, muffled boom in the distance, a split-second hesitation in the steady pace of Cairo traffic. Someone said in English, well, this is it. This is war. This is war with Israel.
Israel struck first, and it struck hard. Within 6 days, the Israelis obliterated the armies of Syria, Jordan and Egypt, capturing coveted territories in the process.
The defeat destroyed us from the inside out. It represented for us a dark obsession, and all of our enthusiasm and dreams and aspirations turned into nightmares and darkness and pessimism.
The war exposed the divisions, deceits and decay within many of the Arab nations. Saadallah was at the forefront of those questioning the authorities and their narratives. Openly calling the war a defeat made him a threat.
He wrote the play, and he was influenced by the mental wound the defeat had inflicted on him. After he finished it, he sent it to those of us in the theatre for us to have a look at. We read it as a kind of secret manifesto.
The play was titled A Soirée for the Anniversary of the 5th of June. The name itself a sarcastic swipe at the official government narrative.
The regime at that time started its oppression and refused to admit there had been a defeat. The Arab leaders called it a setback, as a way to try and dress up what was in reality a defeat. The play was forbidden when it was printed. The idea was that we would show the play, but not through the National Theatre or under the auspices of the government. Of course, we faced many problems with censorship.
Saadallah and his new theatrical troupe eventually managed to get the play staged in Damascus in 1971.
He broke down the barrier between the actors and the audience in a way that viewers took part in what was unfolding on the stage.
The start of the performance was deliberately delayed to build tension. The director, as played by an actor, came on stage to apologise that the show he had commissioned would not be shown after all. A playwright named Abdelghani, again an actor among the crowd, stood up to protest and an argument erupted. Abdelghani shouts, "But don't forget that defeat diminishes the imagination." To which the director replies, "Defeat?" Abdelghani retorts, "Yes, defeat. Does the word shock you? Or perhaps it has a strange ring to it." The director concludes, "To hell with defeat. Who's talking about that?"
You have to remember that it is a play within a play about how the officials dealt with the events of June the 5th. The play was supposed to be a fun party, but this is how the officials thought and dealt with the issues. At first, the audience was not prepared for what was going on. They were surprised to the extent that sometimes there was chaos and misunderstandings, and members of the audience would shout at the actors in the crowd.
The play within the play descended into a farce and ultimately collapsed as actors playing villagers wandered on stage to dispute what actually happened when war broke out and they fled their lands. The play concluded with an official in the front row stopping the production, accusing everyone of sedition and placing the whole audience under arrest before having them all escorted out.
Sadallah was worried at first in breaking down this barrier between the audience and the actors, but in the end he hoped that the play would cause people to rise up from the theatre, go and protest and gather to bring down the regime or denounce the tragedy that had just happened.
Some 25,000 people saw the play in both Damascus and Beirut. It became one of the most influential and famous cultural responses in the Arab world to the Six-Day War. But it did not bring people out into the streets as Sadallah had hoped. Some 50 years later, the Assad family still rules Syria, a country savaged by more than a decade of suppressed revolution and civil war. A very famous quote attributed to Sadallah Wanus, we are sentenced to hope. What did that mean to him? What does it mean to you?
It was very important to him to fight desperation. Hope was our ruler. As for me, I've lost my faith in this sentence. After everything that has happened, after the catastrophe that has befallen Syria, we are sentenced with pain. I don't know if today Sadallah would say and mean the sentence in the way he meant it back then.
هلا كان موجود إذا كان بيقولها وبيعنيها مثل ما قالها ولا لا.
That was Faiza Sawish talking to Zach Brovey. Sadallah Wanus died in 1997, just a year after he had become the first Arab writer to be selected by UNESCO to deliver its annual address marking International Theatre Day. That's it for this week. Join us again next time for more insights into revealing moments from the past when the History Hour returns. But for now, from me, Max Pearson, and the rest of the team, thanks for listening. Goodbye.
This is the BBC World Service, and on the inquiry this week...
There have been global calls for the rich to pay more tax, but billionaires often legally game the system so they pay very little or no income tax at all. This week we're asking, can we make the super rich pay more tax?
The inquiry at bbcworldservice.com/inquiry. And at bbcworldservice.com, the food chain.
When you're in a race that lasts months and you have to take all your food with you, what do you bring and how do you cook it? The diet of an endurance athlete. Is food simply a fuel to help them cross the finish line, or can it play a bigger mental role?
This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
Coming up on the Arts Hour with me, Nikki Beattie, it's drama and divas all the way as we head to the opera today. We're meeting some of the talented rising stars taking part in one of the most prestigious international competitions in classical music, the BBC Cardiff Singer of the World. From the US, Reginald Smith Jr. tells us how he was inspired after seeing the African-American baritone Donnie Ray Albert on stage.
That was the first time I saw a black person sing an opera. I thought, wow, man, if he can do it, let me give it a shot as well.
We meet South African soprano Masabani Cecilia Rangwanasha, winner of the Song Prize at this year's competition. And from the Republic of Kosovo, the soprano Elbenita Kaitazi on her journey to becoming an opera singer. All that and more coming up on the Arts Hour.
Hello, I'm Eileen McHugh with the BBC News. Officials in the US state of Florida say they are rushing to demolish the remaining part of a tower block that collapsed 9 days ago as a tropical storm approaches Miami. 24 people are confirmed dead and 124 remain unaccounted for. David Willis reports.
Officials fear a tropical storm that's forecast to hit the Miami Beach area late on Sunday night could bring what remains of the 12-story building crashing to the ground. So they've brought forward the potentially precarious demolition effort, which will involve boring into the structure of the building in order to install explosives, to Sunday morning. Once complete, that effort will give the search and rescue teams access to parts of the garage area that has been the focus of the search.
The former president of South Africa, Jacob Zuma, has for now avoided going to jail. The Constitutional Court has agreed to hear his appeal against a 15-month jail sentence for contempt of court. Mr. Zuma was due to surrender by Sunday or face arrest. Our Africa regional editor Will Ross reports.
Just a day before Jacob Zuma was due to hand himself over to the police and head for prison, South Africa's Constitutional Court has agreed to review its sentence, so at least for now the former president can sleep in his own bed. A decision on whether the sentence is upheld will be made in just over a week. Mr. Zuma argues that in jail his life would be at risk due to the coronavirus pandemic, his age and health. Hundreds of supporters have gathered outside his home in Nkandla, KwaZulu-Natal province, vowing to ensure the former president never goes to prison.
An Israeli cargo ship has been the target of an attack in the northern Indian Ocean. It was on its way to the United Arab Emirates. Here's our Middle East analyst, Alan Johnston.
Reports of this attack came first from a pro-Iranian television station in Lebanon. Soon afterwards, Israeli media, citing defense sources, confirmed that an Israeli-owned ship had been hit. The sources said the crew was unhurt and the vessel wasn't badly damaged. It had been on its way from the Saudi port of Jeddah to the United Arab Emirates. It's not known who was behind the attack, but suspicion will certainly fall on Iran. In recent months, Israel and Iran have been targeting one another's vessels at sea.
Alan Johnston reporting. Tens of thousands of people in cities across Brazil have been protesting against the government of President Jair Bolsonaro over allegations of corruption involving the purchase of vaccines. Mr. Bolsonaro has been accused of failing to take action when warned that senior health ministry officials had agreed to take bribes to buy overpriced doses of an Indian-made vaccine, Covaxin. He denies any wrongdoing. This is the latest world news from the BBC. Poland's former Prime Minister Donald Tusk has taken back his old job as head of the Civic Platform Party with a view to returning it to government in 2023. Mr. Tusk left frontline Polish politics 7 years ago to become European Council President. He now leads the biggest centre-right group in the European Parliament. He told party members in Warsaw that he would fight what he called the evil that ruled Poland in the shape of the socially conservative Law and Justice Party. The governing party is confirming Jarosław Kaczyński, who is standing unopposed for the leadership, in a meeting behind closed doors. The Ethiopian Human Rights Commission has called for urgent measures to ensure the safety of civilians in the northern Tigray region, where 8 months of conflict have left hundreds of thousands of people experiencing famine. The government has denied blocking aid after rebel fighters seized much of Tigray. On Friday, thousands of captured government soldiers were paraded through the streets of the capital, Mekelle, as they were taken to prison by the rebels. In tennis, the British teenager Emma Raducanu has continued her astonishing rise, defeating the world number 45, Sorana Cirstea of Romania, in straight sets in the Wimbledon Championships. After her win, she thanked the crowd for their support.
I'm so speechless right now. At the end,
I didn't know what my reaction would be if I would won, and then that just happened. So, I mean, I'm just so grateful for all the support that I had today. Like, I really appreciate it.
In the men's game, Swiss legend Roger Federer and the Serbian title holder Novak Djokovic are through to the fourth round. The last quarter-final of the Euro 2020 football tournament is underway, with England taking on Ukraine. The English start as favourites, but the Ukrainians believe they can spring a surprise. The winner will meet Denmark, who earlier beat the Czech Republic 2-1. BBC News.
Hello, I'm Nikki Beattie and this is the Arts Hour on the BBC World Service. Today we have a very special show for you. We'll be meeting some of the most talented rising stars taking part in one of the most prestigious international competitions in classical music. The BBC Cardiff Singer of the World. Taking place every 2 years in the Welsh capital since 1983, this internationally renowned prize has launched the stellar careers of some of the world's greatest opera singers.
This evening, I would like to announce the Cardiff Singer of the World winner, Andrei Kimac.
2 years ago, here on the Arts Hour, we watched from backstage as the Ukrainian baritone Andrei Kimac came forward to collect the heavy crystal trophy.
It was something incredible, like my dream.
Only a few years before winning opera's most coveted award and taking home the £20,000 sterling prize money, Andrei had been working 10-hour shifts in a fridge factory to support himself whilst trying to become a professional singer.
Basically, I was dreaming until I wanted to be, opera singers. I wanted to be part of Cardiff Singer of the World. I'm very happy because it means that you must always do what you want. If you have some dream, you must do it.
And now 2 years on, 16 more brilliant young professional opera singers from 14 countries around the world are following their own dreams, all hoping to be crowned BBC Cardiff Singer of the World 2021.
Góðan daginn. My name is Álfheiður Erla Guðmundsdóttir and I'm a soprano from Reykjavik, Iceland.
Sambatsano. My name is Zankboy Ringbold and I'm from Mongolia.
My name is Christina Gansch. I'm a soprano and I come from Austria.
Jeg hedder Nikolaj Elsberg, og jeg bassanger. Jeg kommer fra København.
Manaul. My name is Michael Larivuni and I'm from Madagascar.
I'm Evgenia Sanova. I'm from Russia.
My name is Jusang Park. I'm a bass baritone from South Korea.
Unsurprisingly, this year's competition has been affected by the global pandemic, which has impacted lives and communities in so many devastating ways. For the first time in its nearly 40-year history, the singers have had to make do without an audience to cheer them on in St David's Hall, Cardiff, and most of them have had to quarantine in a hotel room for 10 days upon arriving in Wales. Not that that stopped them singing. Just like my pre-show warm-up, let's meet some of the talents behind those tremendous voices. First then, from the Republic of Kosovo, represented for the first time in the prize's history, the soprano Elbenita Kajtazi.
Kosovo was never part of this competition, and I'm so happy that I am the first one to represent it. It's a huge honor. No one in my family sings, actually. I was the first one. I started to sing in the most difficult time of our lives, but it was an escape for me. So since I was a kid, during the war in Kosovo, I started as a kid to just sing songs in my head to escape the reality that we were going through. And then my first appearance was at the Belgium camp in Durrës in Albania. We were refugees in this camp, and then I started to sing in a children's concert, and everyone started to cry, and it was a very sad song actually, but it was a moment where I noticed that, okay, I think I can touch people's hearts, and I'm gonna keep doing this. When I started to study classical music, when I went into high school, I actually did not know in what am I getting in, And then suddenly I started to have lessons, and my voice went really high. I didn't know what it is. And I had no information about opera, like zero information what opera is. And my teacher explained it to me, and she said, I think it's nice. I think you could do this. I said, yeah, but what is this? I had no information. And when YouTube arrived in Kosovo, I went in like these internet cafes, to listen to different singers. And the first singer I listened to was Maria Callas. And I was impressed from the emotion that she gave me only through this computer, And I said, oh, this is an amazing profession. You get to be different people. You get to experience different kind of emotions. And then I started to just sing opera all the time. In the beginning, not very good choice of arias, because I went really, high, difficult arias. And I was a kid. And I always tell the story that my uncle threw stones in my window in my room when I started to practice, because he said, don't scream, why are you screaming? But then they started to understand, okay, this is what she chose, but is it smart? We don't know, but we are just going to let her do it. My mom wanted me to be a doctor. If I had another life, I think I would have done it, but I'm not that strong to go in a surgery room or something. Like, I'm very afraid from injections, so I was not born for that. And they were, in the beginning, very skeptic about it, but then they really... And that's why I miss my country the most, to be honest, because there is a lot of music all the time. Like, everywhere you go, there is music. The classical world, it's still in its building, it's moving, and there are a lot of amazing festivals in Kosovo. Although we still don't have an opera house, and I'm embarrassed of that, but I still understand it, because it's a country that it's rebuilding, and the rebuilding is taking time. And I'm so proud of my country, even though it's a very young country, but I think it's a very good chance to tell the world that there is a lot of talent in Kosovo, and I cannot wait to go up in that stage and really sing my heart out.
The very talented Elbenita Kajtazi from the Republic of Kosovo. And talking of singing your heart out...
My name is Reginald Smith Jr., and I'm from Atlanta, Georgia, in the United States of America, and I am a baritone. I decided to open with Si Può from Pagliacci because, as we say in America, go big or go home. When I was a high school student, I had the wonderful opportunity to see a live performance of opera for the very first time. I did not know what I was getting myself into. I thought if nothing else I could get out of school, right? That was the plan. And I went and I saw Tosca, and I was just moved and mesmerized by the singing and the acting. And it was really then that I like to say I was bit by the opera bug. character that came out that really shocked and surprised me was Scarpia. And the singer was Donnie Ray Albert, who's still a fantastic singer and singing today. But that was the first time I saw a black person sing in opera. You know, I knew of Paul Robeson, of course, but I didn't know that current people were actually doing it. And here's this black man who's singing his face off, and I was mesmerized. I thought, wow. And so I remember looking up everything about Donnie Ray Albert. I bought his CD, you know, and it became the whole thing. And I thought, man, if he can do it, let me give it a shot as well. And so I've since had the opportunity to meet and work with Mr. Albert. And of course, he wants me to call him Donnie Ray, and I just can't do it. But it's really amazing. And I think that really sort of sparked my interest in opera. One of the things that's really exciting, particularly in opera in America and also throughout the symphonic works and even ballet, is that people are starting to create new works that are relevant to today's society through things that talk about political figures or different things such as an opera about Harvey Milk and dealing with the LGBTQ issues. It's really exciting to see such relevant pieces come to life and become a part of our mainstream culture. You know, I also enjoy doing fun things like karaoke, you know, because who doesn't like Journey in the middle of a bar, right? That's it's the same thing as singing, you know, Nessun Dorma, I suppose. Andiamo,
Love a bit of karaoke. That was Reginald Smith Jr. from Atlanta, Georgia. You're listening to a special edition of the Arts Hour on the BBC World Service. We're meeting some of the extraordinary young rising stars of opera taking part in this year's BBC Cardiff Singer of the World competition. What does it take to win this prize? Veteran American soprano and one of this year's judging panel, Roberta Alexander, has these words of advice for the competitors.
The Cardiff Singer of the World is the Rolls-Royce of singing competitions, classical singing competitions. Even just being in the competition itself is enough to launch the career. There's nothing that I could tell them that they don't already know. Just enjoy it, be yourself, and make the music. This is so important, especially young singers. They put so much pressure to be perfect. I don't want perfect. Perfect is not interesting. I want magic. This competition is so marvelous because everyone is at the highest level and live singing after such a long time. I must say, I think it's marvelous that the competition is going forward. I am very, very grateful because we need this. What I find really hard to grasp is that politicians will say artists or musicians aren't a necessary profession. So if that's true, then turn off your Netflix, turn off your Spotify. It's frustrating and also angering to see how this whole pandemic has affected especially the young people. I see them training for a different job. These are people who have so much to give and so much to offer. So I think that a competition like this, it gives such inspiration to keep going. You know, we need you, we need you.
We certainly do. That was soprano Roberta Alexander, one of this year's judges. As well as the main award, any competitor can also choose to take part in the separate Song Prize. This is presented for the art of singing songs that are not from operas, folk songs, lieder, and other vocal compositions. The winner takes home a magnificent crystal trophy and £10,000 sterling.
And I'm delighted to say that the winner of the 2021 Cardiff Singer of the World Song Prize is a unanimous